Getting to know you, getting to know all about you.
Back in 1989, General Motors introduced a new brand called Geo, made up entirely of small cars which GM never actually built. In order to compete with other economical Japanese cars, GM joined up with Toyota, Suzuki, and Isuzu to import their cars to North America and marketed them under the Geo name. But the brand only lasted 9 model years, with most models later being rebadged as Chevrolet and the brand quickly forgotten. This is a story of the GM brand known as Geo. This is My Old Car.
It's sold and serviced at your Chevrolet Geo dealer.
Getting to know you.
2 years before the incorporation of the Geo brand, arguably GM's most famous subcompact car, the Chevette, ended its 10-year run. The demise of the Chevette was really GM's own doing by introducing additional subcompact imports in 1985, such as the Suzuki-built Chevrolet Sprint, the Isuzu-built Chevrolet Spectrum, and the Toyota-built Chevrolet Nova, the latter bearing no resemblance to the original Nova. And if you're Canadian, you may remember the Pontiac Firefly, which was a rebadged Chevy Sprint. These cars sold well enough to effectively make the Chevette obsolete. The Chevrolet brand represented almost every type of vehicle, not just subcompacts, but also midsize and large sedans, trucks, SUVs, and sports cars. In that sense, Chevy today really hasn't changed all that much, but at the time, GM wanted to strategically market their subcompact segment to young new car buyers. So some marketing genius thought that giving those cars a different brand name would help draw in younger buyers. Although GM didn't really differentiate them by giving them their own dealerships, instead having Geos only being sold alongside Chevrolet. Although there were 5 different models marketed as Geos during the brand's run, there were never more than 4 models existing at any one time. At the launch of Geo in 1989, 4 models were available: the Metro, which replaced the Chevy Sprint; the Prism, spelled with a Z, which replaced the Chevy Nova; the Tracker, which was based on the Suzuki Sidekick; and the Spectrum, which was just a continuation of the Chevy Spectrum. However, the Geo Spectrum only lasted for the 1989 model year, being replaced in 1990 by the Geo Storm, which was based on the Isuzu Impulse. Out of all the Geo models, the Metro is arguably the most famous, or more appropriately, infamous. Yes, the Chevette was cheap, but the Metro took that notion to a whole new level. But since it was a Japanese car, and GM made it clear in its advertising that it was an import,
It's Japanese-built, agile, quick, low-priced, and the highest mileage car in America.
I guess the idea was that Americans would think it would be a better and more reliable car. In the 80s, sadly it was commonplace that anything made in Japan was considered to be better made.
No wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan.
What do you mean, Doc? All the best stuff is made in Japan.
Unbelievable.
The Metro name wasn't entirely new in 1989, having been used on the non-turbo version of the Chevrolet Sprint in 1987, called the Sprint Metro. The 1989 Geo Metro was essentially the same car as the Suzuki Cultus, sold in Japan, and the rebadged Pontiac Firefly, sold in Canada. Suzuki also sold the same car under their own name, then known as a Swift. Although initially built in Japan in 1989, by 1990, GM built all the North American sold Metros and its rebadged siblings in a plant in Ontario, a joint venture with Suzuki.
Suzuki, in partnership with General Motors, is going to invest $500 million in the town of Ingersoll in southwestern Ontario.
The engine options in the Metro showed no improvement in what the Chevette had in horsepower, but mileage improved to well over 50 miles per gallon. It managed this improvement thanks to having only 3 cylinders, offered in both 1-liter and 1.3-liter variants, ranging from 55 to 70 horsepower. Keep in mind the car weighed less than 1 ton, or only about 1,800 pounds, so that should have helped acceleration. Yet its 0 to 60 time was almost 15 seconds, and top speed was 99 miles per hour. Can you imagine driving this tiny car at that speed? Not me.
Come on, man, move this thing. I can't. It's a Geo.
The first generation Metros initially only offered 3 or 5-door hatchbacks, but starting in 1990, you could also buy a Metro convertible, which eliminated any practicality the car once had by eliminating the rear seat, so as to have a place to stow the soft top. The loss of the back seat meant the convertible actually weighed around 50 pounds less than the 3-door, so clearly they didn't add much, if any, structural reinforcement to account for the missing roof. This ragtop existed solely for people who wanted to have a ragtop at the absolute cheapest price, but eventually lack of demand killed the convertible by 1993. Second-gen Metros started in 1995, gaining a 4-door sedan model which replaced the 5-door hatchback. Anti-lock brakes became an option, dual front airbags were standard, and chassis upgrades improved stiffness and safety. The Metro soldiered on beyond the end of the Geo brand in 1997, continuing as the Chevy Metro until the 2001 model year. It was replaced by the Chevy Aveo in 2002, built in Korea by a company named Daewoo, which had gone bankrupt and was taken over by General Motors. In hindsight, not one of GM's brightest ideas, but that's a whole different story. The next car in the Geo lineup, the Prism, was derived from a variation of the Toyota Corolla and replaced the Chevy Nova. Slightly larger than the Metro, the initial versions in 1989 offered 5-door hatchbacks and 4-door sedans. The sedans proved to be more popular, resulting in the hatchback only being sold through the end of the Prism's first generation in 1991. Back then, a hatchback was typically considered a lesser alternative to a sedan, despite being more practical, so the Prism sedan was considered more upscale to the Metro, as if it would be possible to be any less upscale. The Prism's engine output was huge in comparison to the Metro, offering a 1.4-liter 4-cylinder making 130 horsepower in GSI trim. By the second generation starting 1992, engine output increased to 1.8 liters, and even leather seats were an option. GM continued to sell the Prism as a Chevrolet after the demise of the Geo brand in 1997, with the Prism selling until 2003, where it was replaced by the Toyota-built Pontiac Vibe. Also starting with the launch of Geo in 1989 was the Geo Tracker, a small SUV that was nearly an identical twin to the Suzuki Sidekick that it was built alongside in Ontario. The Tracker was body-on-frame, allowing it to be classified as a light-duty truck. It also could be optioned with 4-wheel drive, offering a transfer case to allow 2- or 4-wheel drive low gearing, and had a convertible option, making it a direct competitor to the Jeep Wrangler. Powered by a Suzuki 2.6-liter 4-cylinder, it wasn't fast, making only 80 horsepower, but its off-road suspension made it clear what its purpose was. The Tracker only had one generation during its entire run under the Geo brand, sold as either 2-door convertible or hardtop. Although the Tracker was a rebadged Sidekick, the Geo, and later the Chevy nameplate, helped separate it from Suzuki, which some consumers may have associated with its more infamous model, the Samurai. The Samurai was a smaller compact SUV, which the media blasted due to footage recorded of the car almost rolling over during high-speed lane changes in the magazine Consumer Reports. The Sidekick and the Tracker were a different design, so they didn't have the same risk, but Suzuki's overall reputation was tarnished as a result, resulting with it exiting the North American market and filing for bankruptcy by 2012. In 1998, the Tracker, now branded Chevrolet, began its second generation being a rebadged Suzuki Vitara, as opposed to the Sidekick. This second-gen Tracker was more rounded and more car-like in shape, and reverted to a car-based rack and pinion steering, as opposed to its more off-road focused truck design it had before, making the second-gen Trackers less desirable for off-road use. However, this didn't stop Suzuki from continuing to produce the Vitara-based Tracker in Mexico and Central and South America, keeping the name Vitara there, although in some cases they were badged as Chevrolet Vitaras. The last model under the Geo name was a personal favorite of mine at the time, the Geo Storm, but it was also the shortest lived. Launching in 1990, 1 year after the start of the Geo brand and replacing the Geo Spectrum, the Storm was based on the Isuzu Impulse. Although Isuzu sold a version of the Storm in Japan, known as the Gemini Coupe, the North American Storm and Impulse lacked the Gemini's optional turbocharger, all-wheel drive, and Lotus-designed suspension. The Impulse can be traced back to 1980 in the US market, when it was called the Piazza, riding on a modified version of GM's T platform, the same one used for the Chevy Chevette. Renamed the Impulse in 1983, the first gen looked nothing like the Chevette and lasted until 1990, when it was redesigned to share the platform with the Geo Storm. The Storm quickly proved to be much more popular than the Impulse, likely due to the much larger GM-backed Geo network being sold in Chevy dealerships. With 1.6-liter 4-cylinder engines making 130 horsepower, the Storm initially was only sold as a liftback, or coupes as they called them then. Although in 1991 and 92 they also offered a different hatchback model, which was known as the Wagonback, the coupe was far more popular, making the Wagonback a rare find today. Although still an economical subcompact, the Storm was relatively well received when tested by automotive publications such as AutoWeek and Road & Track, even being compared against cars like the Mazda RX-7. The upgraded GSI trim offered even more power, with a 1.8-liter 4-cylinder making 149 horsepower. A unique feature of the Geo Storm was what made it a favorite of mine, the partially concealed headlamps. I once owned a 1990 Pontiac Sunbird with a variation of that same look, but just like the Pontiac, and probably because of cost concerns, the headlamp doors didn't last. 1992 and 93 Storms lost the headlamp doors and instead had small quad headlamps, a look that GM also used in the same year on the Pontiac Grand Prix. Despite selling well in the US, and also in Canada starting in 1992, the fact that the Storm was built by Isuzu is what led to its short model run of only 4 years. The Impulse was doing so poorly that Isuzu discontinued it in 1993, and as a result, they stopped building the Storm as well. It's hard to tell exactly why GM abandoned the Geo line after only 9 years. Although the Geo brand never had its own dealerships, instead being sold alongside Chevy, it's likely the extra overhead of maintaining a separate brand wasn't worth it for cars that weren't much different than what they were once as Chevy models. So the Geo brand quietly folded in 1997. Like many other cars of that era, Geos were consumables, making any working versions a rare find today. But they were the first new car for many, so I expect many still hold fond memories for these little Japanese imports. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, please click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today, and you would like it featured in a future episode, leave a comment, or contact me at the email address shown here. See you next time.
I guess he didn't see me.